We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
There is a chorus of angry voices in the White House, all directed at China. President Trump prides himself on being a brilliant businessman, but he says China has been ripping off the United States and has become its economic enemy. Economist and Fox News commentator Peter Morisi thinks the president is right.
China, they behave like criminals. They basically strong-arm American companies who want access to China's market to give away their technology.
So why are US companies investing there? Well, China is the second fastest growing market in the world with a population of 1.4 billion people and a growing middle class. Labor is still relatively cheap, and crucially, if you want to access that massive market, you have to make your products in China. Companies that do that pay a heavy price.
They can only own 49% of the companies. They have to take a 51% joint venture partner and teach that joint venture partner what they do. They have to give away technology in order to gain market access. We're in a trade war. We've been in one for 20 years. China's been making war on the West, and we haven't been fighting back.
Okay, so the US thinks China is getting an unfair advantage. But is that how China sees things?
China does not want a trade war. The old system worked incredibly well for China. In the previous 30 years or so, they have raised something like 800 million people out of poverty. It was a huge achievement by any standard.
That achievement has created huge expectations. President Xi has to keep lifting people out of poverty. The US says China does that by routinely stealing intellectual property. China says that's hypocrisy.
The United States did exactly the same to the intellectual property rights of European countries back in the 19th and early 20th century. The US only became a champion of intellectual property rights after the US became a champion in intellectual property.
So President Trump hit back at China by increasing tariffs on Chinese goods, including steel and aluminium, making it harder for Chinese companies to squeeze profit out of exports to the US. So will China back down?
For President Xi Jinping, he is projecting himself as a kind of strongman of China, and therefore he cannot afford to be seen to back down under American pressure. But then you also have an American president who seems to feel that he must have the final say on whatever it happens to be. So you are in a situation where the two leaders will be playing chicken. And whether one will back off or not, we don't know.
So the world's two biggest economies are locked in a stalemate. Neither can afford to back down. Should we be worried?
The guns are loaded for a trade war. We're creeping into the danger zone because it doesn't look like there's a lot of room for concessions on either side.
The last time a major trade war erupted, it didn't end well.
The biggest one is considered to be the 1930s, when the whole world trading system really imploded, with all countries around the world raising tariff barriers, imposing quotas, foreign exchange restrictions, and the volume of world trade fell significantly and is thought to have contributed to the Great Depression of that decade. So that's sort of this very bad dynamic for the world economy.
So history shows that a continuing standoff between the US and China could have consequences for all of us. And if China's economic power continues to grow, it could force a rethink of the entire free market system.
China is saying, we are the second largest economy in the world, and we have the right not just to follow the rules of the international trade system, we have the right to set some of these rules now.
This is exactly what the Trump administration has been trying to avoid. But if it wants to stop China rewriting the rules of globalization, it needs to find some allies, and fast.
I do think that the United States can't go it alone and force China to change its positions. We need to creatively be working with the Europeans, the Japanese, the Canadians, other very important trading markets for the Chinese.
But wait a minute, didn't Trump slap massive tariffs on the EU, Japan and Canada in the past few months? Why would they help? Well, the US and the EU recently agreed to avoid a trade clash and work towards zero tariffs. And supporters of President Trump, like Peter Morisi, say the stakes are simply too high for America's allies to stay on the sidelines.
The tragic mistake the Europeans are making is to confuse their dislike for Donald Trump with their national security interests. Just as China's technology play is a threat to American security, it is a threat to European security. If they don't join the Americans and the Chinese succeed, the best thing they can do is to start learning Chinese.
Now, whether or not you agree, the experts' advice seems to be that trade wars are best avoided.